Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we're going to interview a gentleman by the name of Michael Castleman, whom I have decided is somewhat a triple threat of a guy. First of all, he's here to talk about his new book called A Killing in Real Estate, a Mystery. It's published by McAdams Cage, which is a local San Francisco publisher. And this is the third book in a series telling the exploits of Ed Rosenberg. The first one was called Death Caps, and the second one was called The Lost Gold of San Francisco. And now we have my favorite title, A Killing in Real Estate. And one of the things that Ed remains is an amateur as far as sleuthing is concerned. Why is that?
I like the amateur sleuth subgenre of mystery fiction. You know, a lot of mystery fiction is about alcoholic ex-cops or alcoholic cops or alcoholic ex-special forces guys.
Who've been so wounded.
Yeah, and they're loners, and they're just sort of weird, sort of John Wayne Rambo figures. And I'm more interested in writing about regular people who are living their lives, and then suddenly something extraordinary happens to them. In the case of Ed Rosenberg, he's a journalist. He works at a fictional chronicle called the San Francisco Foghorn. And unlike most, detective fiction sleuths, he's married. He's happily married to a very nice woman. He's got kids.
2 kids.
He's a regular guy, and I feel like that's what I'm more interested in writing about, is regular people.
Now, on the personal side, your real life, if I may use that term, you are a player, I would say, in the San Francisco real estate market, and you've been everything from evicted tenant to evil landlord.
That's right. Yes, I was evicted once from an apartment I was living in, and that led me, my wife and me, to actually buy our first place. We were in one of the first tenancies in common in San Francisco, which is now it's an alternative to condominium ownership. It's a way to own a building jointly with other people. But when we did it, which was 1980, there just weren't very many. In fact, we were in the third tenancy in common in San Francisco.
I was going to say, you were a real pioneer in that aspect.
Yeah. And so I got involved in real estate. Subsequently, we bought a house that had an in-law unit underneath it, and I wound up becoming an evil landlord of this one unit. And I was really nervous about it. I didn't know, I'd heard so many horrible stories about how impossible it is to be a landlord. And I had had very bad experiences with landlords myself. I just mentioned I was evicted and it was an illegal eviction. So what I found was that I actually enjoyed being a landlord. It was kind of funny.
After that experience, a lot of people would have moved to Des Moines.
Yeah, well, I charged below market rent on my in-law, and I fixed everything when it broke. And so really the people were pretty happy in there. And meanwhile, I was making very good money. So in my main life as a journalist, I was, a freelance writer, which meant that I didn't have a boss telling me that I had to have my butt in a chair for so many hours a day. So I could buy small properties, and if something went wrong, I could just sort of drop everything and go deal with it, which is what I did. And over the past 25 years, I have slowly accumulated 14 units, all of them in the Mission District of San Francisco.
Okay.
And I'm proud to say that I'm making very good money on my units, while all of my tenants pay at least 15% below market rent.
That's amazing.
So people who tell you that it's impossible to make money as a landlord in this town are in error. I'm making very nice money, and my tenants have a very good deal. And the typical tenant in San Francisco stays in a unit approximately in the range of 18 months to 2 years. My average tenant stays 4 years.
Wow.
So I get the feeling that they're content and happy, and I call myself the evil landlord to my own tenants.
In quotes.
Because it it's kind of a joke, but at the same time, it recognizes that the landlord-tenant relationship is inherently awkward. I mean, I'm in their bathrooms, when their toilet breaks, I'm the guy who fixes it. That's a kind of strange intimacy. But at the same time, I try to be convivial and cordial, and I'm nice to them, they're nice to me, and we all get along fine. And so I call myself a sort of socialist landlord or a micro-developer of affordable housing. I've got 14 units, and I'm very content.
The third of the triple threat of you is this very successful health writer that you are, which you do on a freelance basis.
Yes, I've been a freelance health writer for 35 years, and I write about staying well. I write about mainstream medicine, alternative therapies, nutrition, fitness, and sexuality, and I freelance for national magazines.
Wow. Well, we're interviewing a very busy man about a book that's very intriguing. It's a mystery, it's a murder, and it's also very historical. We'll talk more about it when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
We're talking today to Michael Castleman, who is the author of a book called A Killing in Real Estate, a mystery, published by McAdam Cage. And interestingly enough, this novel starts, a lot of it, the early part, starts with historical stuff, seemingly unrelated to the business at hand of real estate. It focuses very much early on the great dock strike in San Francisco of 1934. Why do we go there?
Well, I wanted to write about the dock strike for many, many years, and in the novel, the grandfather of the murder victim was a dock worker who left a diary, and my protagonist, Ed Rosenberg, is a historian and friend of the victim who essentially inherits the diary from the dead guy and wants to figure it out. It's written in an odd style, and it's sort of incomprehensible, actually. And so Ed researches the diary, and he's not researching the murder of his dead friend, but as he looks into the diary and talks to people who are still alive today, who were around during the strike in 1934, he stumbles on information that may have something to do with the murder, and he tells the police, and then all of a sudden someone throws a Molotov cocktail through his garage window and tries to kill him and his family by burning his house down. So, but my own interest in the dock strike has been here was one of the seminal events in 20th century San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And in 21st century San Francisco, very, very few people have even heard of it. I mean, everyone's heard of the earthquake of 1906, and people remember the Loma Prieta in 1989, and people remember the Giants arriving in 1958. But if you say the dock strike or the name Harry Bridges, who was the president of the labor union that struck, people who are labor activists go, "Oh yeah, Harry Bridges," and everyone else goes, "Who?"
Unless they call him a commie.
Well,
that's the other possibility,
right? And I just was irritated by that. I'm a progressive political person myself, and I feel like labor history is important. And it was really the dock strike of 1934 that turned San Francisco around from being a very staunch Republican city to the beginning of the San Francisco we know today as a liberal political place. People are often shocked to hear that San Francisco didn't used to be very liberal. In fact, it was very Republican. And in the 1934 dock strike, the shipping company owners were going to hire strikebreakers to break the strike along the Embarcadero. But the very conservative Republican mayor of the city at the time said, "You don't have to spend your money on strikebreakers. I'll just give you the police force." And that's what he did. And there were pitched battles between the San Francisco police force and the striking labor union daily up and down the Embarcadero. People were injured. 2 people were killed in the strike, and no one's ever heard of it. And so I thought, well, I don't want to write a history text, but in the context of exploring fiction, I feel like the dock strike is something that is crucial to what San Francisco is, and that people ought to know about it.
One of the aspects of that strike situation that you get into is the fact that because there were police battling workers, it often became a situation where family battled family.
Yes.
That O'Rourke was a worker and McCarthy was a cop.
Right.
And they were clashing every day for weeks on end.
The dock workers were, San Francisco was and continues to be, but even in the 1930s was even more, a very heavily Irish and Irish-American city. And the dock workers were predominantly Irish-Americans. Meanwhile, the San Francisco police force was overwhelmingly Irish-Americans, and when the mayor gave the police force to the shipping companies to battle the strikers, it was a civil war in the Irish American community. I mean, families had people on both sides, strikers and cops. Church parishes, every church parish in San Francisco had people on both sides, and it was a very difficult time emotionally for a lot of Irish Americans. And actually, after the strike was over, many families did not speak to each other for years because of the lingering bitterness that was caused by the strike. And so in Killing in Real Estate, the guy who kept the diary was a striker, and his lifelong best friend wound up being a cop. And when the strike happened, that lifelong friendship ended, and it ended very bitterly. Very bitterly, involving arson. Arson's a big thing in this book, a very, very big thing. As Ed follows the story, trying to understand the diary and unravel its mysteries, he runs into a lot of different people, or they run into him perhaps. There's a woman, I think her name is Molly, who seems to know what happened back in 1934, but does she? Well, that's part of the fun of writing novels, is you get to play with different characters. And this book, I explored writing about very elderly people. I'd never written about anyone who was over about 70 before. And in this book, Molly, who is 92, and there's another woman who's in her late 80s. And so I got a chance to write about very old women, and that was a lot of fun. And they love to talk, and they love to tell history, if you will, as they see it or remember it. Yes, they're full of stories, and they're lonely. They're lonely, and they want company. Another person that you run across, your character runs across, is Mistress Rod, the professional dominatrix. Yes, I've got a pro-dom in the book, and of course San Francisco is one of the nation's capitals of fringe sexuality, and there's a huge BDSM community here, and the guy who's killed is left in a BDSM way, and although that turns out to be something a little different later. Of a hoax, yes, it does. Well, things get even hotter as you go along in A Killing in Real Estate, and we may let you in on some of it. Just stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
Yes, we're talking on Conversations on the Coast today about a mystery, and it is titled A Killing in Real Estate. Its author, who's with us, Michael Castleman. It's published by McAdam Cage, and it does wonderfully take us back in time in the history of this wonderful city of San Francisco. And one of the things that you talk about is development way back when. you talk about an interesting progression, at least this is the way I saw it, from a place in the Mission District called Woodward Gardens to the stuff out in Golden Gate Park that we have then and now for recreation, and then what's going on in the Armory on Mission Street, which I have a note next to that, perhaps the final irony of it all.
Yes, the Mission and 14th Street is today the home of the San Francisco Armory, which is a huge fortress-like building which has been used to store weapons and munitions for the military, and ironically, it was used to house the National Guard troops who tried to break up the dock strike of 1934. But before it was the Armory, that site was San Francisco's first and most beloved amusement park, a place called Woodward's Gardens, which was a 10 acres of lakes and streams and goats pulling little carts for kids to ride in and rides and live pheasants walking around the place, dropping their feathers, which children were then invited to take home with them. And there was a museum of weird and wonderful things that had been collected by Mr. Woodward, who was a gold rush pioneer rich man in his travels around the world. And he had a big carousel and all kinds of stuff. And in fact, when Golden Gate Park was designed in the 1880s, the designers of Golden Gate Park basically decided to make a bigger Woodward's Gardens. And all of the things that were in Woodward's Gardens are in Golden Gate Park, lakes and streams and a carousel and a children's playground, all that stuff. Woodward's Garden was then ironically driven out of business by Golden Gate Park, but it had about a 25-year run from the 1870s to the 1890s. And then the land was leveled, and initially there was going to be housing put up, but it wound up, after the earthquake of 1906, the original San Francisco Armory burned down, and they thought, let's put the Armory here, and so that's why we have the Armory there today.
And what business is being conducted in that Armory today?
Well, it's funny you should mention because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of there's some BDSM sex in A Killing in Real Estate. And while I was writing the book, in fact, the Armory had been vacant for 30 years, since 1972.
Yeah.
The Armory had been vacant, but it's a National Historical Landmark, so you can't change the facade, you can't tear it down, and you really can't alter it too much. And so, of course, nobody wanted it. Who wants a used Armory that looks like a dungeon inside? Well, somebody did want it and paid $15 million in cash for it. It's a company called Kink.com.
Excuse me, the name of that company again,
Kink,
sir?
Kink.com.
That's what I thought you said.
And they make BDSM videos for a family of about 4 dozen websites on the World Wide Web. And so today, the San Francisco Armory is essentially a porn studio that specializes in BDSM sex.
As they've said for so many years, only in San Francisco.
Yes, if you live long enough,
yeah.
you see everything.
Getting back to the plot of the novel, as they say, someone in San Francisco in the novel has been buying up an enormous amount of real estate in the Mission. Somebody else, or maybe the same someone, has been setting fire to places, including Ed Rosenberg's house. And whoever's behind this is taking great pains to conceal his or her identity. And the wonder here for Ed is, could the mystery buyer have something to do with all the arson fire and with Duffy's death? In other words, is there a way of tying all of this together? Becomes the
right.
plot enigma.
The main plot of Killing in Real Estate is about real estate development in San Francisco, specifically in the Mission, and the development of transit villages, which are high-rise apartment towers around the BART stations.
Right. And they have to be specifically so many feet from
so many feet from the
platform of a BART
platform.
station? Yeah.
Yes, to qualify for the zoning that allows you to violate the height limit and build big towers. And, of course, anyone who has lived in San Francisco or pretty much any big city, but particularly New York and San Francisco, where real estate development is a contact sport. And it is part of the life's blood of any city. But in this city, real estate development rises to a whole other level of fascination and insanity. And I've always been fascinated by real estate development. And as I became a small landlord myself, I became even more fascinated. And they say in fiction, write what you know. So I thought, I'm going to write a little bit about real estate development.
And one of the things you write about are the monopoly names that developers give their shell corporations.
Yes.
Is that true?
Absolutely true. The LLCs in real estate are often named after the places in the in Monopoly. And in fact, one of the apartments I own, I bought from a group called Baltic Avenue Associates, which is a Monopoly name. That's how I got the idea and looked into it. And my lawyer said, oh, yeah, people are always naming them after Monopoly.
We've been talking not long enough, I dare say, about a wonderful book. It's a mystery. It's also gives you a lot of San Francisco history and a feel for the place and what goes on here. It's called A Killing in Real Estate. The author, Michael Castleman. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.